Japan by River Cruise is made possible thanks to those who donate to the show at japanbyrivercruise.com and due to the generosity of our corporate sponsors. This week's show is brought to you by Japan Tours International.
Cherry blossom in full bloom, a cup of warm, expertly prepared matcha, late night strolls to pokey neighborhood sake bars. If you're picturing your Japan adventure in 2022, then call us today. We'd love to hear from you, you f***ing idiot. Obviously you're not going to jostle with the rest of your stupid bus tour to get the best shot of Kinkakuji. Hint, it's never going to be as good as one of the literally thousands of professionally taken ones, so don't even bother. Clearly no one's going to want to go for a pint with you when you are the reason people think that a new variant is spreading. Oh, and that amazing restaurant you really wanted to try, it's closed for good now. So, if despite all evidence to the contrary, you're still planning your epic vacation to Japan next year, then we want to hear from you. Seriously, we'll even let you book your entire trip. You're so stupid, we're betting you don't even know how to ask for a refund. Japan Tours International. We're angry because we don't have a business anymore.
Hello, Brian, and welcome back to Japan by River Cruise. I'm Bobby Judo.
And I'm Ollie Horn.
And joining us this week is Tobias Harris, the author of the Abe-ography, The Iconoclast, former risk analyst at Teneo, and senior fellow for Asia at the Center for American Progress. You'll remember he compiled a report on the geopolitical implications of that massive river cruise passenger database that was breached in 2018, but for security clearance reasons, we're not going to be able to discuss it here. Tobias, thank you for your service.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
On this week's show, critics have called Japanese Prime Minister Kishida too much of a known quantity. And this week, Kishida clapped back with, "Yeah, I'm a known quantity, and that quantity is a 62% approval rating, baby." We'll ask Tobias about what other ways Kishida could negatively impact our own lives to get across that coveted 65% line. Plus, Ollie's got your weekly river cruise recommendation. Ollie?
Yes, Bobby, this week's recommendation is for Corka's first gender-neutral river cruise. I'll be interviewing later in the show all the people who are inexplicably angry about this. Fair warning, there are a lot.
Also, we'll check out the Celebrating American Animation River Cruise in Akihabara. Set sail with all of your favorite animated characters from The Simpsons, SpongeBob SquarePants, Adventure Time, and more, right here in Japan. Now with 100% less humor and 3,000% more merchandise. All that and more coming up, but first, it's Soap Talk.
So Brian couldn't be here tonight because his wife asked him which was more important, recording the show or her birthday celebrations. So tonight he's spending some time thinking about how he's going to break the bad news to her.
Tobias, you've analyzed international policy risk and you're a senior fellow for Asia. Isn't that a bit ironic considering that one of the largest policy risks for Japan as a nation is arguably having too many senior Asian fellows?
And we're off.
That was... But, you know, it's not just Japan, right? I mean, you know, it's too many senior Asian fellows is a problem that many of Japan's neighbors are also coping with. So
I would like to ask you, Tobias, about the fact that you are a commentator on Japan, but you're not based in Japan. Do you feel smug about this? Because I do.
I mean, look, I miss Japan and, you know, would love to be back and commentating about Japan from Japan as soon as the borders are open for me to do so. But, you know, sometimes, I mean, look, just having distance can be healthy, you know, and thankfully these days, you know, I've got my streaming TV and my newspaper subscriptions and, you know, the delightful chatter on Twitter, and you can glean a lot from that. And sometimes
All right.
that helps.
But Bobby and I, our faces lit up when you described the chat on Twitter as delightful. We are now going to probe you about that.
Yeah. We're very involved in the Japanese hot takes Twitter sphere. And on Twitter, everyone has an opinion, especially about Japanese culture and Japanese politics. But you've had an entire career where it's been your job to have a well-informed opinion about Japan. So I'm curious as to what you think of the state of kind of Twitter discourse in the Japanese Twitter sphere.
Well, you know, look, I you know, also started sort of my career doing this as just, an anonymous blogger writing about Japanese politics. So, I've been a person talking online about Japanese politics for a long time. And a lot of that blog discourse has now moved to Twitter. So there's some quite good analysis, I think, available on Twitter. I think, people have found a way to use it as a valuable medium for sharing good articles and things like that. But at times, I think there are things I see that are irritating, and the most notable thing being, the regular expression that Japan is somehow not democratic, or just sort of matter of factly, of course Japan's not a democracy, and I think it is just it's just bullshit. It is just bullshit.
So without naming names of people who routinely get things wrong, like Jake Edelstein.
Hey.
What's
It's Jake Edelstein.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. If I'm going to be rude about him, I'm going to be rude correctly. Enemy of the show.
And most frequent guest. After Rochelle Kopp.
What are the takes? What are the most common takes which you think this is just lazy? People are just saying this because other people say it.
Well, look, I've seen a number of very bad takes about Abe. He's he's a Nazi, or he's and look, like the Japanese right wing, there are plenty of odious opinions on the Japanese right wing, but the point is that they're a fact of life, and if you're going to look at them, it's worth getting them right and sort of understanding where they're coming from, which is why I ended up writing an almost 500-page book about Abe, because I thought it was important to get some of the nuance right. Look, I did not write that book as a fan of him, but I thought it's important to understand and to get the facts right. And just too often, I think there are a lot of lazy assertions about the right when there's plenty of legitimate criticisms to make, and people are just too loose with the facts, I think, about the right wing.
How big a gap is there between the bad hot takes in the English language Japan politics Twitter sphere and the Japanese Twitter sphere?
Oh, there's got to be a much more diverse range of all sorts of takes, good, bad, and just batshit crazy in the Japanese Twitter sphere.
And which is fine, like when you're sort of talking online about your own country's politics, there's sort of a forgiveness, it's a democracy. You can have all whatever. It's you're welcome to have whatever opinions you want, and it's people can have whatever opinions they want online. There's not a bad take police, unfortunately.
Well, Bobby does his best.
I do my best.
Because man, some people would be in trouble if there was. But it's if people are in Japan, it would I think. It's almost just as a matter of courtesy, doing the work to understand the place where you're living. Maybe that's, curmudgeonly of me and reflecting my age, but the fact is, I don't think there's an excuse, because I do think there's a lot of really good analysis out there and a lot of really good insight, and you don't have to work that hard to find it. And so, ultimately, I would just like to see people just put in the work and do, try to find it where it exists.
I'd like to see that. I'd also like to see people more willing to kind of be like, whoops, I made a mistake. I don't know so much about the political takes, but I'll see a lot of Japan culture takes, or Japan bad English takes. And I think I saw somebody criticizing Japan's wet aged beef. There was some shop that had a sign that said wet aged beef, and wet and dry aging for beef are a thing, and it wasn't English. And I pointed that out, and they were just like, yeah, but it's funny. It's like, yep, it's funny, but it's also inaccurate.
It's not funny for the reason that you originally said. Well, at this juncture...
you know what, Ali? I can see you're looking for a segue. Just go, speaking of wet-aged beef.
Okay.
The segues to this next section get worse every week.
All right. So speaking of wet-aged beef, we need to thank people for buying us wet-aged beef money. This show is now officially not asking for money for coffee. We are contributing to our wet-aged beef fund. So we have two people to thank. The first is Pat Sheehy, who bought 500 grams of wet-aged beef, who says, "Hey guys, have an annual sub." So that's getting us a lot of wet-aged beef. By the way, quick segue. Have you heard of the Beef and Dairy Network podcast? No, you haven't. Okay, if there's any listeners to this who are looking for a new podcast and like this style of humour, if that's what you can call what we're now doing, go and check out the Beef and Dairy Network podcast and report back. Try an episode, you'll piss your pants laughing. Anyway, Pat Sheehy says, have an annual sub. Your work brings me a lot of genuine enjoyment, and I wanted to say thanks in the best way possible. Money. Wrong. Money's the second best way possible. Bobby, what's the best way possible?
Wet aged beef.
That's right. Hope the barbecue is going well. Can you barbecue wet aged beef? Probably not. You won't see her. Okay, and hope that Ollie's tour was good. Actually, my tour was bad, and Bobby and I will discuss why it was bad in our secret show. If you want access to the secret show, join our mailing list, japanbyrivercruise.com. And we got another 100 grams of wet aged beef from someone else, didn't we, Bobby?
Yeah, R.M. Holdsworth bought us a coffee, and this was funny. You know how they say charity is relative? On first glance, I looked at this account name and I thought it belonged to my friend Reed, who is an international lawyer who owns his own law firm in Tokyo. And I know what he bills per hour. And I saw this and my first instinct was like, dude, one coffee, come on. But then I double checked and it's not his account, it's someone else's. And in their profile, it says that they do, quote, digital content. So I've revised my reaction to sincere gratitude for this incredibly generous donation. Thank you very, very much.
Of half of this person's net worth. Thank you very much to both of you. And finally, we are going to have a special holiday show, a seasonal festivity show that we're going to be recording next week. So if you'd like to send any festive messages for us to read out to the other Brians, then please do so by going to japanbyrivercruise.com and clicking on the Fax Us button. With that, Bobby Judo, shall we jump into the news? Bobby Judo, what's in the news this week?
Prime Minister Kishida's approval rating is up, which is something that I read in a series of articles that all seem to find the smuggest looking picture of Kishida I have ever seen. Does this mean he's starting to come into his power? Tobias, could you give us a little bit of an idea of how you see the current power dynamics in the LDP?
Well, after Kishida, when he won the LDP's leadership back in late September, he came in with some pretty disappointing approval ratings, certainly compared to his predecessors. And, it certainly looked like he was not going to have a honeymoon period. And after a surprisingly strong performance in the general election at the end of October, he now, I think, is belatedly enjoying that honeymoon. And I think, whereas, the talk when he first took office was, well, he's, a puppet of Abe, he's a puppet of Aso, he's not going to... he doesn't have enough power of his own. Now, at least, I think has shown, by winning an election shows, I think, look, the party loves a winner. And so he showed that he was a winner. He was given the opportunity to really choose his own secretary general in a way that he hadn't been when he first won, when Amari suffered a rather embarrassing defeat in his own seat, although in his own district, even though he was revived via proportional representation. And so, that gave Kishida a chance to move Motegi over from the foreign ministry to the LDP secretary generalship, and then pick his own man and longtime Abe rival Hayashi Yoshimasa as foreign minister. And so all of that, I think, allowed him to flex his muscles a little bit. He still has the same problems he had before, though. He is the relatively moderate or liberal head of a party that has a very strong right wing, and it is going to be watching everything he does. And if he is perceived as deviating from what they want, I think they will let him hear it.
So I've heard you speak in the past about this idea that Japanese prime ministers don't have as much political power, as much political control over shaping policy and making decisions as kind of administrative heads in other countries. To what extent is Kishida kind of beholden to fall in line with what other people in the government want him to do?
Well, I mean, for the past quarter century or 30 years or so, I mean, the prime ministers have gotten stronger. They have been able to set the policy agenda more than they had sort of pre-1994. And so you've had a big shift really in favor of the prime minister, and Abe promoted that and then took advantage of that during his long tenure. And the question, I think, what's interesting now is whether we are going to actually see the pendulum swing a little back towards the LDP, precisely because of these dynamics, where you have a prime minister from a relatively small faction, from an ideological tendency that is not necessarily the mainstream tendency now? And will he be forced to bend more to the party than, say, Abe, who represented the dominant tendency within the party, kind of flexed all of the policymaking power that he had and that the prime minister's office had? Will Kishida be more constrained because of his political circumstances? And that sort of remains to be seen. And I think even if the balance shifts a little back to the party, because of institutional changes, Japan's prime ministers are just so much stronger than they used to be in the past, and they are capable of deciding what the government should do in a way that many Cold War era prime ministers would have envied.
But are they stronger just because they're better at managing their party?
I mean, some of it is that. Some of it is just that the LDP has changed in so many. That the factions, they still exist, but it's unclear, exactly, how powerful they are when it comes. I mean, certainly they're not necessarily policy-making entities. They're not group. They're groups that are really much centered on the personalities at their heads and are basically clubs to advance the prospects of their members. But even then, when prime ministers form their cabinets, they're not necessarily hewing to a strict factional balance, maybe like they did in the past, when they're distributing, sort of the vice minister jobs and sort of the lower level political jobs. Those are not necessarily as a result of factional influence. And the other big changes that were in the past, you did have these policy tribes in the LDP that would basically determine what policy was in coordination with bureaucrats, right? So they would meet with the bureaucrats, and the prime minister would say, "Well, hold on a second, I want to do this," and the policy would sort of be made at the lower levels with backbenchers working with bureaucrats. That just is not really the case anymore, and that the LDP as a policy-making entity, it just does not have that kind of clout anymore. I think there are people in the LDP now who would like to change that and maybe go back to an era where the party was stronger in policymaking. I mean, I think Takaichi, who's now the head of the LDP's policymaking outfit, I think would definitely like to flex her muscles and influence the policymaking agenda. And we saw, we're seeing that in certain ways, but it's not as institutionalized as it used to be.
One of the things that will always exert influence on what politicians in power do is public opinion and public reaction. And we recently saw something sort of surprising with the reaction to Kishida's entry ban and some of the backtracking that he did there. And I think I saw a lot of people assuming that he was going to come across as weak for going back on some of what he said with the entry ban. And then we saw this turnaround where his approval went up, and there are, 86% of the country?
I think it was 89 in Yomiuri. I think 89% approval, which, it's very hard to find 89% approval for anything. So yeah, it was a pretty striking
What
number.
did he do?
So this was the decision to, at least the way that question was phrased was asking about suspending booking international arrivals.
There's two elements. One was the foreign entry ban of non-Japanese nationals, and then there was the other complete entry ban. And I think
stopping flights
altogether. So even Japanese nationals would not be allowed to return, and that's the bit that he backtracked on. So I think there was a sense that the flip-flopping was going to show weakness, but instead he's come out of it somehow looking very strong.
Yeah, I mean, but it kind of stands to reason, right? It's like, I'm making a policy which is not going to affect you, potentially only for the better in the public's mind. Obviously, people are going to go, yeah, fine, brilliant.
Yeah, I mean, in the way that, the way that question was phrased too, I mean, I think there's only so much you can take from it. What I think it tells you, and so much, I mean, this is, in every country around the world over the last, almost 2 years now, that some of the politics of, dealing with the pandemic some of it's just about showmanship, right? Mm-hmm. And showing, okay, we're taking this seriously, we're acting decisively, we're acting swiftly. And, oddly enough, I mean, this was always, I thought, the paradox of Abe and COVID, here's a politician who, if we read his book, he opens, there are politicians who fight and there are politicians who talk, basically, or who don't fight. And, he, always presented himself as someone who's going to be decisive and, good in a crisis, and he would react and he would, do whatever it takes to defend the country. And here he was faced with this, genuine, international crisis,
Right.
both with multiple dimensions, public health, the economy, and he dithered in ways that I think were actually quite surprising, just given how he talked about himself and the kind of way he presented himself as a politician, and was actually very dragged his feet and was very reluctant to act when it was required of him, and he paid the price for it. Really, his numbers really suffered, I think. And so again, a lot of it's not, we should be careful that often it's not about the substance, often it is about appearances. And I think that's the lesson Kishida has learned, going back to the LDP leadership election, being very clear, fighting the pandemic is my number one priority. I'm not going to rest on our laurels. Yes, the numbers are down, but I'm not declaring victory. This could get a lot worse. There could be another wave. We have to be ready for it. And I think he's learned the lesson that a lot of the, benefiting politically from the pandemic. I mean, and that sounds maybe kind of like a weird thing to say, but to make it to not suffer what in ways that Suga and Abe did, that you have to be willing to look strong and to look decisive, and
even if what you're doing is not scientifically sound, or
that it's very much, it's not necessarily about the best policy or the right, that a lot of it is about showing that you're taking it seriously, and maybe that is a knock on democracy, and why are people so easily sort of impressed by that, but that seems to be how the politics of COVID have played out.
There is a distinction between the politician themselves looking strong and their policy making being strong and consistent. I remember when I first subscribed to The Economist, which was back in 2013, the first issue I got was that the cover said, is it a bird? Is it a plane? No, it's Japan. And it was a picture of Abe dressed as Superman with the word Abenomics underneath. And that legacy of kind of Abe being linked with the economy, and Abe himself being kind of a strong, one-track minded leader, carried through his premiership and back to when he returned. Is there any chance of Kishida generating that same kind of image about himself linking to one key policy?
It's hard, because I think it goes to show the influence Abe had, and that he has, I think, constrained the options available to every one of his successors. That so in the end, he kind of wrote the blueprint, or drafted the blueprint, and it is very hard to see what room Kishida has to chart his own course or to come up with his own vision. And that, yes, he's talked about new Japanese capitalism, but then when you look at what's actually being proposed under that, they're all things that were done during the Abe years. And maybe that's because he was around for so long, and Abe had a kind of throw everything against the wall and see what sticks approach to economic policy making. But the reality is, I mean, he tried a lot of things, and it's, at the moment, it is very hard to see anything really that Kishida is doing that's dramatically different than things that Abe tried.
Well, talking about new capitalism and Abenomics, even that recent stimulus package that Japan approved, recently approved its, second largest ever economic stimulus package. Did Abe kind of pull the strings on that behind the scenes as well?
So he has been quite vocal about this particular stimulus package, but again, even more than pulling the strings, it's actually even bigger than that. And for me, I think the most important
I think I saw an article where he said he was quoted as saying something that was roughly along the lines of like, I told Kishida to do it, and he's going to do it.
Maybe we need to take some of that with a grain of salt, because I think there was so much pressure pushing in the same direction. So for Abe to say that, I issued the marching orders, I think it was bigger than that. But also he can take credit actually for something bigger, which is, the LDP in 2012, when he became leader again, was in many ways a fiscally hawkish party. Where the dominant, I think, position was, we need to reduce our debt, we need to balance the budget, and very aggressively in favor of raising the consumption tax. And what the LDP now, almost a decade later, is now predominantly in favor of more deficit spending. And that I think I think made the LDP become much more comfortable with deficit spending. I think he has marginalized the fiscal hawks so that they have a much harder time making their case. And we saw this very unusual essay by the Jimajikan of the finance ministry during the general election campaign, where he criticized politicians of all parties for their willingness to spend money and sort of disregard deficits and deficit spending. And the LDP now after during the pandemic massive deficit backed stimulus packages, and they're still doing it. And so you almost have people now in the LDP who are quite comfortable basically embracing modern monetary theory and saying we don't have to worry about default. We issue our own currency, we don't have to worry about this, we're fine. And that is a huge intellectual shift, and it is one that now seems actually fairly embedded. The right wing seems to have embraced it, and given the power they have in the party, that is going to be a lot of pressure in favor of continuing to run deficits. I mean, I think I've now taken maybe you've seen on Twitter, the LDP is now the guns and butter party. We're going to give you more defense spending, we're going to give you more Social Security, we're going to give you more fiscal stimulus, and we're going to be we're going to press on the gas of fiscal stimulus, and that's and we're going to be that party, and that is a huge change.
Well, it's very nice to hear that Abe is behind one big package, because obviously the biggest mistake was he sent 66 million little packages of rubbish masks. So at least he's learned that lesson. There's two things that you've said that I want to pick up on. The first is, do you think this is kind of a COVID response, that governments all around the world realise that, well, they've got to respond to COVID? Maybe that means printing money. I mean, the Conservative government in the UK is spending at a rate that Labour governments were having potential Labour governments were having wet dreams about. So is part of this that there's this appetite for deficit and government spending has come from the fact that the public are now cool with it because of COVID. The second thing is, you mentioned military spending. So can we talk about whether Japan's going to start being a bully boy? So first let's talk about this deficit and whether that's a temporary thing where it's only possible because there's an appetite for it because of COVID. And then later, can we have the scary talk, please?
Sure. So, I mean, just quickly to the first question. I mean, I think, of course, COVID, such a unique situation and emergency that I think it led a lot of governments to shed their inhibitions about deficit spending. And also you had years of very low interest rates, and I think, you look at low, we can borrow and not, not worry about how much it's going to cost us to pay it back. And that's actually, I mean, the remarkable thing about Japan's giant debt mountain, that everyone talks about, their interest payments, considering how big that is, when you're paying, virtually no interest, it's, fine. You can, it's sustainable. Is it sustainable forever?
This is the exact same conversation I had with my wife about buying the house.
But, over a long enough time horizon, can they assume that interest rates are going to stay like this forever? I mean, maybe not the best, but it does seem like they have, you can certainly run larger deficits for longer. That certainly seems to be the consensus. So,
all right.
So the second question, I think, you look at how much, China is now spending on its military, and Japan is not coming anywhere close to that. So when we talk about the alarming defense spending in East Asia, it is not Japan. And I think, I don't, for all, kind of the talk about, well, Japan reached the 1% limit, which was not actually a formal limit by any means. They're not going to come anywhere close to 2% of GDP defense spending anytime soon. The LDP can talk about how they want to get there. It's not going to happen. There's, I think, going to be a lot of pushback within the ruling coalition from Komeito. I think there are a lot of domestic priorities that the public is going to expect the government to meet before they get anywhere close to 2% defense spending. I think, you talk to defense policy experts who know a lot more about this than I do. I think there are real questions about Japan's ability to even find things to spend on. That it doesn't, to absorb that much defense spending. A lot of any spending increase would end up being absorbed by manpower to a certain extent, and that's really their biggest expense at this point.
Right. So can they just lie? Can they just say that they've spent all this money, keep everyone happy, scare China, and when they go, what have you spent it on? They'll go, oh, like special invisibility tank. Look at that. Very good. Hey, thanks very much for listening to this episode 110 of Japan by River Cruise. Don't forget, Christmas is coming up and the most important person is you. So buy yourself a monthly membership to Japan by River Cruise at buymeacoffee.com/Japan by River Cruise.
And thank you to our guest this week, Tobias Harris. Tobias, it really was a pleasure talking to you.
Thanks. It was really great. I really enjoyed our chat. And keep an eye out for my forthcoming review of Defenders of Japan in Nikkei Asia.
Thank you very much.
Great.
Thanks for listening, and we will see you next week.